A huge welcome to today's Science Talks, a huge welcome to BLOXHUB, and a huge welcome to all of you out there watching and participating in today's Science Talks. It is such a pleasure to welcome you from near and afar. As our previous Science Talks, it warms my heart to see that we have participants from abroad, we have academia, we have startups, we have knowledge centers, we have public institutions, we have exactly the array of participants that we hope and aspire and dream of. So thank you to you all for taking time out to participate in our first event of a wonderful series of 10 events in total. So I thank you, the audience. We're delighted to have you here. And before I forget, I would also like to thank our partners, because without our partners, we would not be able to host and run this wonderful series of healthy buildings. So to LYS Technology, thank you, thank you, thank you. I'd like to thank PropTech Denmark, Aalborg University Build, Danish Sound Cluster, and Velux. It is wonderful that we're able to collaborate and develop and host this series of 10 events together with you guys. Thank you. Our indoor climate has a significant impact on our health and cognitive functions. Study after study shows that our well-being and performance improves dramatically with higher rates of ventilation, optimal humidity, lighting, noise control, and well-designed spaces. So what does it take to turn that knowledge into action? It's time to look beyond those four walls. And as some of you have noticed, I'm not alone today. Thank God for that. It is a deep dive into the subject matter of the importance of light. And I'm delighted to welcome my co-host today, Paula Miseikyte from LYS Technologies, scientific lead, with a personal background in sleep medicine from University of Oxford. And in a few minutes, when Paula has set the scene with the importance of light, just to introduce the topic, we are also delighted to introduce our guest from England today, Manuel Spitschan. That introduction will wait in just a few minutes. But before I let you give the introduction to all of you participating out there, there is a chat function on YouTube, and you're more than welcome to ask questions and comments as we go along, because we'll make sure to have a Q&A session with Manuel later on today. But without further ado, Paula, thank you for joining me today, and thank you for setting the scene.
Well, thank you, Pernille, for the introduction, and hello, everyone. So I would like to give you a brief overview of today's Science Talk. So after my short introduction, we will begin our conversation with Dr. Manuel Spitschan, which will be then followed by a Q&A session. So to briefly introduce myself, so once again, I'm Paula, and I'm scientific lead at LYS. And LYS in Danish means light, and our core mission is to live healthier with light. And we have developed the tools that integrate science, technology, and data to improve well-being outcomes and induce behavioral change. And we do this by the means of a wearable light sensor, the app, the well-being programs, and light integration. So today we are here to talk about the importance of light. And indeed, light is the integral part of our indoor environments. Similarly, light is as essential to our physiology and our health. But we still tend to favor minimal requirements and energy efficiency when it comes to light. And people are not that aware about the importance of light as they are about the importance of physical exercise or nutrition, for example. So what is the problem? So nowadays we spend significant time indoors, and we inhabit the cities. And we no longer rely on our natural day and dark cycles for our sleep-wake cycles. And it used to be for thousands of years. So this has had a profound impact on our physiology, and we really need to start looking into how light affects us throughout the day. Unfortunately, today, the indoor lighting is still too much focused on the visual aspects of light. So, for instance, energy efficiency, as well as aesthetics. And we do not pay enough attention to the biological effects of light. So let's take a closer look at what we already know. So for the last 30 years, scientists have been examining our visual system, and the pivotal discovery was related to these photosensitive retinal ganglion cells and photopigment melanopsin, which uncovered the pathways by which inputs are delivered to the circadian rhythm system. And for those who are not that familiar, so circadian rhythms regulate our sleep and wakefulness. So they are these 24-hour cycles that are part of our body's internal clock, running in the background, carrying out the essential functions and processes. And light is especially important because it ensures correct synchronization of our internal clock with the environment. And we really started understanding how light exerts a variety of physiological and behavioral responses, and what consequences could arise because of the disturbed circadian rhythms. And we do want to avoid sleep problems, impaired information processing, cardiovascular risks, endocrine and metabolic disorders, fatigue and performance issues, for instance. And I would like to give you a real illustration how sleep and circadian patterns can change. So we've analyzed our data at LYS, and we've noticed that during the initial lockdown, people spend less time outdoors, and they spend more time in front of their screens, especially in the evenings. And we've also noticed that they slept longer, and however, this did not translate to improved sleep quality or perceived sleep quality levels. And we've also noticed a shift in our chronotype distribution. And for those who are not familiar, chronotype is individuals' tendency for preferred timings of activity and rest. And you might have heard terms of night owl and morning larks. So we've noticed this shift toward more later chronotypes, and this could be due to a number of reasons, but it could also be associated with increased screen time in the evenings, as well as reduced time in the natural daylight. So let's pause here. So we briefly talked about the problem and the scientific evidence we have today. But how do we make our indoor environment more centered around individuals' health? And I want to give you real examples so that it's not only a theoretical concept. So basically, we need to raise awareness. And at LYS, we do this by means of a wearable light sensor that allows users to understand their everyday environments and light's impact in real time. Secondly, we need to achieve behavioral change at the personal level. And we do this with a combination of a coaching app and well-being programs. And thirdly, we need to achieve light integration, and we do this at LYS, and we believe that light integration should be personalized. And all of these tools are designed to be used by members of various industries, this way fostering collaboration, which is another essential key to finding the solutions. And lastly, I wanted to include this information because we do aim to translate the scientific knowledge so that is understandable for everyday person who has no previous knowledge into this topic. And also we want to raise awareness, so that's why we made our app, free version of the app, available to download from App Store, where you can identify your chronotype, learn more about biological rhythms, and calculate your social jet lag. And social jet lag is this misalignment between internal and social clock that has been linked to various adverse health outcomes. So without further ado, I would like to thank you for your attention. And it is my great honor to introduce Dr. Manuel Spitschan, who is a visual neuroscientist and university research lecturer at the University of Oxford. And he has been interested in the effects of light on visual and non-visual functions on human physiology and behavior, and has published a number of articles on this topic. In addition to his research work, he is currently the chair of Optical Society Color Technical Group, as well as the past and the current member of technical committees in the International Commission on Illumination. So hello, Emmanuel.
Hello, it's a pleasure to be here.
It's a really pleasure to have you here today joining us.
Yeah, we've been very, very excited, as you know, in our preparation for today. We've had some conversations with Manuel, and I don't think I lie when I think you've sensed that we're very happy. We have been giving a few dances of joy to those of you who are watching. Manuel, I started out by introducing Paula to say this is a great reassurance to me, actually having an expert in light interviewing you today alongside me. And we have prepared a few questions, and thank you so much for taking time to share your expertise with us. And the first question, we've divided our interview into various topics, chapters. And for those of you watching, I thought it would be nice for you to know the chapters. And the first chapter is on the importance of light and the evidence that we have today. The second chapter is on the problem. And the third and final chapter will be on the solutions. So there is a red thread throughout the conversation that we will now embark on. And going to the first chapter, namely the importance of light and the evidence we have today, if you were to describe your area of research to a non-expert on light, it could be me. How would you describe your area of research?
So I think this is always a good question to start with. So what I'm really interested in is how internal processes in our brains and our minds and our bodies broadly are controlled by external environmental stimuli, such as light. And so we've known for a long time that there is a clock in a part of our brain, and that clock is exquisitely sensitive to light, to the extent that that clock can be synchronized and set by the external light and dark cycle. So, as an example, when the sun's out and it's bright, that sends a signal to that clock. And during the night, when the sun is below the horizon and shining on another part of the world, obviously that part of the clock is not active. And my research really kind of tries to understand, well, how do three components work together? The first one is light and the light environment that we are in. The second one is, how do these signals of light, how are they processed in our eyes? And then the third, well, what are the consequences of light exposure and our exposure to the daily light-dark cycle?
Excellent.
Yeah, and actually, because it's such an important topic to touch upon today. So what do you say is the function of light in our biology? And could you elaborate on what I also mentioned, the light being the strongest environmental cue regulating our circadian rhythms?
Yeah, definitely. So there's these very, very strong effects of light on our physiology and behavior. And so generally speaking, in research, there's two types of effects that we would consider when it comes to the biological effects of light. The first ones are those that are related to vision, right? Light illuminates our environment, enables us to see color, motion, spatial detail, etc. And so these are typically called visual functions. And in addition to this conventional or canonical vision, as we might call it, there are the more profound and more fundamental effects of light. And those are the ones that affect physiology and behavior. And so this includes the setting of our internal rhythms to the external light-dark cycle. So a synchronization process that basically says, hold on a minute, what time is it based on the light information? Let me adjust my internal clock. This is called circadian phase resetting or circadian synchronization. Another aspect of light, another important aspect of light, is actually the acute suppression of certain hormones that are produced by the body. So during the day, for example, the hormone melatonin is not produced. And in the evening, as the evening approaches, melatonin production increases. And if you expose yourself to a bright light in the evening, that will then suppress the production of melatonin. And that is quite a profound, to me at least, a profound influence of the environment on internal processes. So it's really a key signal for our body and our brains to say it's day and it's night.
And when I was introducing you, your focus is on visual and non-visual effects of light, and maybe you could help us to understand what is actually meant by those non-image forming effects of light. And could you give us a real-life example with regards to indoor lighting?
Yeah, exactly. So I think broadly, the distinction that we can make here is in terms of the cells in our eyes that are responsible for these effects. So we've known for a really long time that there are cones and rods in the retina. The cones allow us to see in color, and they give us this very high spatial detail view of the world. We can, see during daytime intensity, daytime light levels. The cones are the photoreceptors that enable us to see. The rods are the photoreceptors that give us kind of rudimentary vision in dim lighting conditions. And really, this cone and rod system is responsible for most of the visual effects of light. So this includes, color vision, spatial vision, discrimination between different patterns, etc. Everything that we would typically associate with perception and visual perception. In addition, then there's another class of photoreceptors that you introduced, which are the so-called intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells. And these are photoreceptors that are independent of the cones and rods. Their discovery only dates back about 20 years. So it's a relatively recent discovery in the history of neuroscience. And what's really interesting is that they are able to signal information about light independent of any cone and rod input. So it's almost as if you had a parallel photoreceptor, a parallel sensor that tells you it's day and night, that is independent of the photoreceptors that enable us to see. And so this obviously then has important consequences, because the way we think about light, typically in lighting design or architecture, or anything related to the productive use of light, as it were, typically has been focused on optimizing visual aspects of light, which do not capture these non-visual aspects of light. And so we're now kind of at an important, I'd say, crossroads almost, where we need to integrate all this emerging knowledge from biomedical science and from biology into how we think about the lighting environment, the lit environment, really. So for example, if I wanted to know, well, what is the impact of a given light source on my circadian system, then using, for example, a metric like lux, which is illuminance, only gets me so far, because the underlying sensor that is responsible for taking care of this light is not the one that enables us to see. And so I think it's really an important kind of time to say, well, we need to incorporate these biological effects of light into how we think about lighting spaces.
Thank you for your answer.
Yes.
Yeah, it's really
because this is basically what I would assume would have been considered as a paradigm shift in the research of light and how we perceive. So just to get it straight, when we're talking about this, what you've just explained to us, how is light then interacting with our functioning during the day and with sleep during the night?
So broadly speaking, there are, I'd say, two interesting things to think about. So the first one is light intensity, or the overall effect of light it might have on the circadian system or on our physiology. And so this basically depends on how bright the light is. But more importantly, the timing of light exposure is really, really key to understanding it. And it turns out that when you expose yourself to the same light in the morning versus in the evening, the effects are almost completely opposite. When you expose yourself to a very bright light in the morning, such as, you go out for a walk after breakfast and you walk your dog, you get exposed to sunlight, that will, in most cases, advance your circadian rhythm. So it will move the timing forward. It will make it earlier. If you expose yourself to the same light in the evening or at night, it will delay the clock. And therefore, it is really important to understand that the same light under different circumstances will have very, very different effects. In a way, obviously, there are effects that you want to avoid. For example, delaying your circadian clock in the evening. But advancing your circadian clock in the morning is actually something that's quite beneficial. And so throughout the day, then obviously light exposures, or the same light exposure, will have just different effects.
Maybe a leading question, but if I were to ask, what is some of the most important findings in your research when it comes to the important with regards to health? Would what you've just said be one of the most important aspects that so far you have ascertained in your research?
I mean, I think as a researcher, I always, I'm obviously kind of very much, as researchers, obviously, we kind of generate knowledge that will kind of be maybe not immediately relevant for health. And so there's a number of interesting discoveries that were made in the last couple of years that I think will have an impact or a translational component maybe down the road in 5 to 10 years or so. I think the most important realization really to me is still this fundamental realization that the way we think about light, right, is, we need to think about it quite differently than we have in the past. And I think slowly, research communities are beginning to understand that, for example, expressing light or irradiance or illuminance and lux is just not sufficient. I think from my own research, I have a couple of examples of really interesting findings that really surprised me. So as I mentioned, there's a component of intensity, right? So generally it is thought that the brighter daylight exposure, for example, the better your clock runs, broadly speaking. And so I had the pleasure of working with a population of patients who have a specific genetic mutation that makes their cones in the retina non-functional. So these are called congenital achromats. It's a very, very rare genetic mutation. The consequence of having no cones is that these people are very, very light sensitive to the extent that they will avoid daylight. They will have often visual aids that basically sunglasses that will allow them to move around in the world even when it's brightly lit. And so what we tried to find out was, well, under these conditions where you have no cone photoreceptors and you are severely light sensitive, what happens to your circadian system? What happens to your rest activity cycles? And so this is really early research, but one of the findings that we took away from this research was that it looks like there is some type of adaptation to the reduced light exposure, such that their rest activity cycles appear to be normal. So again, this is relatively early stages of research, and we're really looking forward to expanding on this. But I think it points to a possible adaptation of these neural systems that underlie the clock. And I think it makes you wonder, well, how do other things that change, for example, in our lifetime, affect these the circadian system in an adaptive way? So I think this is probably, to me, one of the more important shifts also just in the research landscape, to think, well, these things could in principle be modified, and there's some plasticity, what we call plasticity, so some flexibility in responding to the type of light that we get exposed to.
Which is it's really, really interesting. And we're moving along to the next chapter in our interview, namely the problem, because it's become, to some, well known and accepted that we spend so much of our time indoor. There is the rule of thumb is it's a minimum of 90%, so we can multiply our age with 0.9 and actually ascertain how many years we've spent indoor. It's a depressing answer. I encourage you all to try it. But just to given your latest research findings, it's quite interesting if we start addressing or label light, that there can be bad light. So as we're moving indoors and spending so much time indoors, can you help us try to understand the consequences of bad light? Like what does that actually mean to us as human beings that used to be so much outdoor?
I mean, I think thinking about kind of good or bad light, I think it's really useful to understand, to kind of put our visual system and our circadian system kind of in its evolutionary context, where most of the light if not all of the light that we were exposed to was light from the sun that was filtered through the atmosphere, daylight, what we typically call daylight. And obviously, there are a couple of characteristics of daylight that are just incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to recreate using artificial light. The first one is spectrum, right? So the sun happens to be a radiator that basically produces photons of all wavelengths, relatively speaking, and these then get filtered through the atmosphere. And it just happens to be the case that it's very, very, very difficult to produce lighting technology, specifically LED technology, that can emulate the spectrum of daylight. There are now some solutions out there for this, but it's still only a relatively recent finding. I think also there it's important to realize that most of the design of light sources has been really focusing on aspects like illuminance and color rendering, and not so much focusing on the non-visual effects of light. The second major difference, I would say, is the spatial distribution, what we call the spatial distribution of daylight. So if I go outside, even when it's overcast, I basically have the entire sky that can illuminate my surroundings and illuminate, basically allow me to have light entering my eye. And obviously, in any indoor space, you typically have light bulbs that might be diffused, or the light might be spread out in some way using, for example, these diffusing panels here. But it will never have the same, it will never take up the same space as, for example, daylight. And so then we are basically just summarizing these two things, spectrum and spatial distribution. We're always kind of in you might consider this a suboptimal, or in suboptimal illumination. And of course, then the consequences of this is you will never reach daylight intensities that you would have if you were living outside, for example, or spending your day outside. And it's known that indoor workers get much less light than outdoor workers. That is, that just follows from the types of light sources that you're exposed to. But there's another component here, which is with electric light and all the light sources that we have in the home environment, we can basically extend the natural day for as long as we want. And so that is, I think, the critical component here. So right now, obviously, it's winter. So at least in England, the sun sets at, I think, 4 p.m. But I will have light exposure well into 11 p.m. or so. And these, obviously, the light environment that you're exposed to is very, very different from one that humans might have evolved in. And it is really these components, these evening light exposures, that are, I'd say, the problematic ones, because they will lead to phase shifts. They might delay sleep onset, and they might, in most cases, they will probably modify something about the production of melatonin.
And actually, my question, so what do you think would be really costly consequences of this bad indoor lighting, and what do you think we should definitely take the most care of?
So it kind of is very much interlinked, right? So light exposure affects the circadian system affects sleep, and we know that sleep loss will lead to, for example, a higher probability of developing mental health problems. You also have physical effects, right? So effects on your body because your circadian clock is misaligned. There's some indication that circadian misalignment leads to deficits in cardiovascular health. And in a way, all of these compounded together really create the possibility of having many, many different negative health consequences, some of which are probably offset by, or can be offset by activity and exercise and so on. But I should also note that I think a lot of the long-term consequences of chronic circadian misalignment and chronic light at the wrong time really aren't very well understood. And I think this is, to me, should be at least a priority in research to say, hey, this is something that we can modify and we can change. So let's do it effectively.
So because this is why we are here today, and this is part of your research work, to us really understand the consequences, which would help us to reprioritize light. But what issues we are currently facing, in your opinion, that we really need to address?
So I think it's a multi-component problem. I think the first one is, I think, the general availability of light and light sources. The fact that we can expose ourselves to light at the wrong times, I think, enables us to create self-select environments that are just, in a way, not good for us. I think there's also probably a strong psychological component here, right? So I think there has always been this idea, well, cell phones or exposure to smartphones at night, that is problematic because of the blue light content. But I think, to me, and I should say I'm trained as a psychologist originally, and I've moved kind of into this field through kind of various routes. I think there's a strong component of behavior that we really need to understand. And I think that is, coming back to this question, the example of smartphones, well, why is it that we are exposing ourselves to bright smartphones late at night? It's probably because there's an interesting news item, or we want to chat with friends or family. There's something that keeps us psychologically interested in this. And to me, then, it's not just technology. It's not just like the passive specification of light sources. I think we need to understand really, how does human behavior interact with all of these things? And I think that's something that really in research, I think we're starting to address this, but I think there's still much more that we'll need to do. In a way, I think we can optimize light sources all day, but ultimately we can decide what lights we expose or what our light exposure patterns are. And I think this is, to me, something that I think is untapped as a priority in a way, right? I think we could do much more on the kind of behavioral front to say, well, how do we optimize light exposures from a behavioral perspective?
It's absolutely fascinating, and we're moving along into the third chapter of our interview, namely the solutions. And I'd like to tap into some of the things you've just said, and also what you said earlier on, namely that the knowledge of light and the importance of light, given your new insights when it comes, for example, in what we're also talking about in our series, namely healthy buildings. And you talked about the role of, like, the importance of light when it comes to design, the architects, etc. So when we're talking about the solutions, I'd like to ask you in terms of the importance of collaboration. Like, what do we have? What kind of improvements are needed to be achieved in the different industries in order also to collaborate and ensure these healthy buildings?
Yeah, I think this is I think really the core of the problem in a way, right? How do we create an environment or an ecosystem in which the various stakeholders and the various actors can work together productively? And I think, coming from academia and having been kind of an academic researcher all of my career, I certainly sense that there's a lot of kind of siloing away, right? So, for example, I just happen to have a relatively diverse portfolio of research spanning human work to kind of computational modeling to measurements of spectra under natural conditions, which I would broadly consider this interdisciplinary. Ultimately, if you're thinking about how universities are structured, for example, is that most of the hiring decisions are made in departments, right? And so you have this kind of, again, siloing away of knowledge that could be interdisciplinary into disciplines. And I think you see a similar kind of problem in describing, for example, you have academia as a sector, you have industry as a sector, and you have policy as a sector, where really, I think, if there was some neutral ground platform to bring people together, I think that would really, really be a strong asset, I think, to solving these problems. And so, for example, someone like me I might have some insights that will be of interest to someone who's making policy about healthy lighting. But unless I know that someone's working on this, it's very difficult for me, for example, to reach out to someone and say, hey, I got something to contribute. I think there's also this question of, I'd say, I think I happen to go to a lot of conferences, but none of the conferences kind of so scientific and academic conferences, but really none kind of capture all of the things that I'm interested in, right? And so I think this is, again, this problem of disciplines happen to be still kind of quite siloed away, I would say. And I think then it just highlights the importance of collaboration, because I think certain solutions just will be better if everyone kind of works together, and also, I suppose, understands each actor's or each stakeholder's goals, right? Because ultimately, the goals of an academic are very different from the goals of a lighting designer to someone who's, for example, developing products for light exposure tracking, right? I think that conversation is one, I think, that needs also to take place, which is, what are the goals, and how can we be as transparent as possible about the goals that we have in this space?
Yeah, that's great, because when you mention, someone who is responsible for, implementing the policy, I wanted to ask, how do you think we can bridge this gap between the, real life applications and scientific evidence? So maybe, what in your opinion are the tips that we could improve this scientific evidence translation?
So I think this is the, in a way, the $1 million question in a way. But I think there are certain things that can be done, and I think some of these are, for example, very concrete things that funding agencies, for example, can do. So agencies that fund academic research, which is, for example, to promote models in which there might be a PhD student that's co-supervised by an academic partner and a company. Right. I mean, that would be kind of a really great way of putting knowledge together, and then also generating something new, which is a person who has been trained in kind of two different realms. Right. I think this would be, to me, a very strong way of promoting this kind of collaboration. It turns out we do have at Oxford currently a studentship that we advertise kind of going in this direction. So I think these mechanisms exist, but they are still. I think there's still, I'd say, an opportunity for development. I think also there is certainly scope, I'd say, to develop universities look outwards, right? So I think, so I happen to work with the kind of innovation team at my university quite a lot, but I do think there's probably more opportunity to create, I think, what I call kind of these neutral ground spaces, right? Where it's not about negotiating intellectual property or commercializing something. It's kind of I mean, it would be great if we had a space where we could just exchange ideas without, for example, worrying about someone scooping my work or someone taking my idea and making millions with it, right? I think this is sort of if we had such a space, I think that would be really good. But ultimately, I think this comes back to the various goals and interests that different actors have. Some are just not compatible, perhaps.
That's great, because
but I think sort of co-funding mechanisms, I think, is a great way. Sorry, co-funding mechanisms, I think, is a great way to bring academia and the most recent research into practice and translation, and vice versa.
Yeah, because I know you have done some work that translates the effects of, especially non-visual effects of light to real-life applications. So you've been involved in creating a metrology system for CIE, or International Commission on Illumination. So you've created tools, or not tools, but you've contributed that allows members and scientists to contribute to measure the contributions of each photoreceptor, and also see the non-image forming responses of light. And I really wanted to ask you, so how do you think, how important it is that we start seeing the regulatory shifts? So we shift from, just minimal requirements and energy efficiency to something that is, being optimal for our health.
Yeah, I think I would say this is should be a key priority, I'd say, of policymakers in the next couple of years. I think that, so there are now kind of emerging recommendations for how, a space should be lit in terms of melanopic quantities. But I think there's a really, really big opportunity, I think, for regulatory frameworks to be developed that really are clear on what it means for a lighting solution to be, for example, friendly to the circadian system. And I think this is something where obviously fundamental research or basic researchers like me will need to feed into this process. Because ultimately, if you want to make health or well-being claims about a lighting solution, I think you need to understand what the evidence base is that surrounds, the specific claims. And unfortunately, I think a lot of what I've been observing is, I think, kind of a shortcutting of evidence. So, for example, the argument, well, we know there's a pathway that affects our circadian system through short wavelength light, and therefore, we should avoid a specific spectrum. But I think the direct demonstration of this, I think, is something that still needs to be developed. And I think it just happens to be unfortunate in a way that research always takes time, and we are kind of lagging behind in many ways with respect to the needs of, I think, the lighting industry. But I think it's important to get it right, because I think we don't want to be in a position where these regulations would be put into place, or possible regulations would be put into place, based on an evidence base that really isn't solid or robust.
Great.
I have a question, because this becomes the importance of light. I'm thinking public buildings, schools, like workplaces, as you're saying. Like, if we have regulations that can help us, that is really, really good. And as Paula has also been kind of alluding to, could we go from minimum standards to maximum standards? And with that, I have a more kind of colloquial question, because I've been wondering, I'm beginning this importance of light. I know we have the 10,000 steps a day. Like, a lot of people have really taken to that metaphor. We know we have to move. So we've started, people have bought step counters, calculators, etc. There's also been campaigns about you need to have 6 pieces of vegetables during the day. You need to have your anywhere between 7 and 9 hours of sleep, depending your I call it biorhythm. So if we were to kind of come up with have your expertise, as you've been saying, it's also a lot about behavior. So if we were to come up with a tagline to really make sure that people understand this is vital, this is important. We'll discuss the maximum standards. But is there a phrase, is there anything that you have come across that when you are over the dinner parties, etc., you have to understand that light is important because, or expose yourself to 5 minutes of sunshine or something like that? Is there a way in which we can convey the importance of light to the same degree as 10,000 steps?
I think the closest to kind of a catchphrase that I've come is kind of bright days, dark nights. And I think even that, I think, adds a complexity, right? Because it basically says, well, again, depending on when you're exposing yourself to light, the exposure will have different effects. I think it's a really interesting question, right? So how do we, if we say the key is behavior, how do we then implement something that will help people to improve their light exposure? And I think, I think that, for example, when you mentioned nutrition, I thought, well, all this, the public health campaigns about nutrition, I think it took a long time, I'd say, for people to realize, oh, well, all of this is important. I think, I think looking at, this is a more drastic example, but smoking, right? I mean, smoking, it took however many decades to go from the findings that it causes cancer to now, I think in most countries in Europe, it being pretty, I think smoking rates are so relatively low, right? And I think, to me, it's more a long-term process, right? And I think this is, where, again, I see an opportunity of public health people, policymakers, scientists, and people in industry to really work together and kind of say, well, what is it that we need to do to effectuate this change? And again, I think there will be, so for example, if your business is selling TVs, right, then, well, and the goal is to have dark nights, well, you know, these goals might be a little bit misaligned, right? So I think it's important to understand what it is that needs to be done. And I think, to me, I think the public health component really is one that needs to be developed much further at a level that's probably, you know, at a European level, for example.
That's a great answer. So actually, that's very my personal interest, and I wanted to ask you a question. So where would you see quicker improvements in quality of light? So is it offices or, you know, public spaces or residential homes?
I think this is a good question. I think in a way it kind of in many ways, I would think that occupational guidelines or occupational lighting guidelines, if they're strong and they're founded in good evidence, then they will become the norm much quicker than the home environment, which is just much less regulated and regulatable as well. So I think that occupational lighting has to be a priority, and I think is one where the right amount of effort can go a long way, I think, in improving daytime light exposures. And these daytime light exposures will not only support, you know, the current or the acute effects to promote, for example, alertness. There's some evidence that this exists, but also will, you know, make, for example, evening effects of light much less dangerous, because you can, to some degree, modify evening light sensitivity by daytime light exposure. And so occupational lighting then becomes a big opportunity to actually promote worker well-being in this case, and therefore, you know, public health.
Yeah, so as we are kind of approaching, you know, the end of the solutions chapter, so I wanted to ask you a really generalistic question. So, like, what future do you see for our indoor environment and lighting in that area?
Yeah, so I think there's certainly a lot to be said about making daylight more accessible in indoor situations. In many cases, I think this is obviously governed by the types of windows you have, where you're facing, where you are, you know, if you're facing east or west or somewhere else. And I think, to me, the component of daylight light exposure really is one that kind of it should be the priority. I think mostly because it is free. It's not tied to a specific technological solution necessarily. And it is widely accessible, right? So I think I would say the solution cannot be one where we retrofit all of our light sources with a specific new lighting solution that is dimming or changing the intensity. I think the solution should be one where we say, okay, we have some type of indoor light exposure, and we can offset some of these effects by just getting the right amount of daylight light exposure.
And following up on a more general question, but albeit back to the behavior, because we also have different life cycles. So one of the things that I was alluding to, the public buildings, we have the kindergartens, we have the schools, we also have the hospitals, we have the nursing homes. So those, as you're saying, it is kind of a complex area. But the personal tips, going back to your catchphrase, bright days, dark nights, would you say that basically that kind of covers every phase of life?
I think it's really tricky. I think if you have a shift worker, I think I think shift work, for example, is one of these cases where I think it really is very tricky to make generalistic recommendations, because depending on the shift schedule, people will be in different phases of their circadian rhythm. And as a consequence, then light exposure will have different effects. And I think there are many such cases where I think, kind of a generalist statement probably isn't useful. I think for typical day workers, I think that mantra or that motto still holds. And I think for the more complicated situations, which will granted affect many, many people, I think we probably need to invest more in research to say, or to find out, well, how can we support really everyone in society through good lighting? And I think this, again, is one thing that I think comes back to this question of, well, how do you make good lighting accessible to everyone? And I think, again, I think a strong public health component would probably be appropriate. If someone asked me, so, if one of my friends who's working a similar job with similar schedules asked me, what should I do? What's the one thing I should change about my light exposure? I would probably say, well, dim your phones early on, keep your evening environment to be as dim as possible, and in the morning, try to get as much light as you can. I would say one thing that definitely helps with getting morning light exposure is having a pet. So, my dog forces me to go outside and expose myself to daylight.
But obviously that one of the challenges of having adolescents is that their biological rhythm really doesn't appreciate the early mornings exposure. But that's for a whole other conversation. We're fortunate, and thank you for those of you who are active, that we have a few questions. So I'm gonna start asking. I just try to cover all the questions that we've received. We have from Vilusa: has there been any studies on people living in the Arctic where people are forced to spend half a year in dark and half a year in light?
So I am aware of these studies that kind of looked at, I'd say, extreme photic environments. I don't think I can respond competently to that question without looking at the papers, but they are certainly out there. So that there are these studies, certainly, and I would expect probably that you have some adaptation of sensitivity, just because of the prolonged exposure to different lighting conditions.
Anecdotal note, I can share that actually before we were talking to Manuel earlier today, and I shared my story from Greenland, where in the northern parts of Greenland, they're literally in darkness for 6 months. And on the first day of 5 minutes of light, the entire village would run out and they would walk, as we are social beings, in a pack, and not looking at each other, but looking up towards the sun. And I think that it's anecdotal, but it kind of does suggest just the importance of light, as you as a human being would naturally then respond in that way. But thank you for the question, and it's a very good question. Because Denmark, although we're not covered in darkness, we're covered in a matter of grey. And that we talked about that as well, so it's a very good question. Pia Reinholdt has also posed a question, and thank you for that, Pia. And the question is, we're used to short winter days and long summer days. Will it impact our health that we change this rhythm by imposing efficient light for much longer in the winters? That's a good question.
So I suppose it comes to the question of seasonal adaptation in a way, right? So if you didn't have longer days, and you kind of followed the light dark cycle that's natural, given by natural light, I think there are probably some important seasonal adaptations, but I would say that the circadian system and everything we know about it basically adapts to whatever lighting situations we will be exposed to. I'm not 100% sure of kind of the immediate benefits or consequences of having shorter photo periods. But I think it's certainly something that's quite interesting to look at, because we're effectively extending whatever season, we're kind of obviously creating a much different light environment than under natural illumination. I think that's something that we are just beginning to appreciate, I think, in research.
We have another question from Vilus, and this is I think this is a lovely question. It's a change of theme in the way, and here it comes. Do you see opportunities or need for personalized lighting in the office or home environment? I think that's a lovely question.
I think this is really great. I mean, I think it is. I think the way that I think a lot of medicine, at least, is marching towards, which is personalized, individualized solutions. And I think there's already one dimension in which I think we can point to an importance of personalized light exposure, and that is age. There are, the needs of an elderly population are very different from the needs of a younger population when it comes to light exposure. Part of that is due to, the way that light is passed to the lens, which just happens to age, and therefore, let through much less short wavelength light. But yeah, I do think that ultimately, whatever solutions we develop or that are being developed, I think has to take into account the individual needs. I think this is where I think the measurement of personalized light exposure becomes quite important, because if you know someone had a specific light exposure, you can tailor recommendations based on that. And I think it kind of...
Yeah, sorry, no, I was just also thinking when it goes back to the public health campaigns and that level of awareness. It also goes to one of your earlier really good points in terms of cross-disciplinary collaborations, be it practice and academia, be it within industries. And I'm thinking in some of these greater office buildings that the daylight and the rays of light are also very different depending on which floor you're working at, where you're positioned. So that the question is really interesting, because would we get to a stage where it's actually possible then to ensure the personalized lighting in that setting, given where you're at in the office space, and giving, as you're saying, we become much more aware of personal circadian rhythms and other afflictions that we may have. So I think going back to some of your earlier points in terms of that cross-disciplinary collaboration in order to bring forth and construct these flexible solutions.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think it needs a coordinated effort, and I think it saying, I think basically the requirements even to develop an individualized light exposure solution, right? There are so many different expertises that you will need to realize this, and so I think it really needs collaboration and cooperation at its core. And I think we do know. I mean, now there's been some emerging evidence finding that there are, even in evening light sensitivity, severe or quite extreme differences in sensitivity, right? And so then that obviously should also calibrate a little bit how we think about regulations, right? So if we say we need a minimum light level, that will work probably for an average person, but that average person might not really exist, right? And I think this kind of, from a regulatory perspective, then it becomes an interesting intellectual challenge to say, well, we know there's individual differences. How do we feed that then into frameworks that might say we need this amount of light exposure, or we should have this minimum light exposure or maximum light exposure?
Actually, like to add, because and what I do at LYS as well is also very much focused on the personalization factor, and we do look especially in the age factor, but also biological sex. And there has been more discoveries about the gender differences or sex differences in the circadian system. And I wanted to ask, because I know you've mentioned shift workers, and with our natural predispositions, so these chronotypes that I mentioned before, do you think shifts should be adjusted to at least a bit match the person's individual tendencies?
I think this would be an ideal solution, right? Being able to adjust shift schedules to personal chronotypes. I would say it would be a big advance, but I think also when we're looking at, so I guess there's another step that we probably need to do beforehand, which is to feed in all the knowledge we have from chronobiology to the people who design shifts, right? Or shift schedules rather. And I think that is something that happens in certain situations, but certainly isn't a universal thing. So even something as simple as recommendations for shift work rota or shift work schedules could already be a first step, and then going from there to say, well, okay, who are the people who have a late chronotype? When should we optimally use them in a specific occupational setting? I think that would be a really strong move forward to kind of, at a relatively low level with not a lot of technology needed, right? Because we can find chronotype through questionnaires, to really have some impact on this.
And our last question is from Daniel Bachmann. Thank you very much, Daniel. And the question is, what do we know about the subset of IPRCG, GC, I'll read it again. What do we know about the subset of IPRGC M4/M6?
So this is a relatively, I'd say, nitty-gritty biological question. So just to kind of to start at the same square. So there are these IPRGCs that are short wavelength sensitive and express the melanopsin photopigment. There appear to be different types, and these types differ in terms of how big they are, where the connections go, and also what kind of inputs they get. So some IPRGCs, for example, get cone input and rod input. I think we know much more about this in the mouse retina than in the human or the primate retina. But I would say the picture isn't fully complete, mostly because it's relatively difficult to measure from primate retinal ganglion cells. You can imagine it's a very difficult research program to do. But certainly from what we know about mouse retina, which is the predominant biological model, is that different IPRGC subpopulations do different things and project to different targets in the brain. But I think certainly there's a lot more knowledge that needs to be developed, I would say, at this very cellular level. How much it will then affect how we think about light, I am not sure. I mean, I think these different cell types they'll probably respond differently to light, but they all share one photopigment, which is the melanopsin photopigment. And so I think if there are functional consequences, I think it would be very interesting to know about them.
Thank you, Manuel. We've reached the end of what I think was an odyssey into the importance of light, and I hope all of you who have been participating and watching that you also find now it's not just 10,000 steps. It's also, I take with me some interesting points, not only the importance of light, but also the adaptation, that we're actually very resilient in our ability to adapt. And it's not just looking at the technological aspects of light and the rays of light, but it's actually also addressing our own behavior. With that, there are significant negative consequences from a health perspective if we deprive ourselves of light. So while we are enmeshed in the darkness in Denmark, I hope that whenever you find the ray of sun over the weekend, you will peep out, as the beautiful Greenlandic people will do when they see the first rays of light. You will also have received an email expressing our gratitude of participating today. There will be a small survey of evaluation because we always want to do better. Please take time to send your feedback to us. To Manuel, I don't think thank you is enough to express our gratitude. It has been such a pleasure spending time with you during our science talks. It was a formidable way to start our series of healthy buildings. And we're not done with light. We will have a debate on next week, the 9th of December. It's a Wednesday, same time as today we'll start. And we will actually be focusing on these cross-disciplinary collaborations, the connection between academia and practice, because we need to move forward and ensure that the importance of light really permeates the entire industry when it comes to designing, creating, building healthy buildings. So thank you so very much to you, Manuel. Thank you to all of you out there. Thank you to Paula. I could not have done this without you.
Thank you, Pernille, for your great moderation skills.
You're more than welcome. You saved me, so we know that. And Manuel, thank you again. A huge round of applause. If we were here, you would hear it in echo. But thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. It was really a lot of fun.
Thank you. See you soon.